So this training is really meant to be a 101, Human Trafficking in Colorado 101, from a statewide perspective. We do specialize, LCHT specializes in training a lot of systems folks, people who are likely to come into contact with a survivor of trafficking, law enforcement, CASA advocates, child welfare. We have healthcare provider specific curricula. We have an educator's curricula, and as well as a curricula for youth specifically. So while this is going to be a more general 101, we are more than happy to get something scheduled with you and your team to take a deeper dive into subject matter that's more relevant to your work or to your geographical area. And I will make sure that you know a little bit more about that a little bit later. And so as we get started here, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you for, choosing to turn towards this really challenging topic at such a challenging time in our lives. It's really amazing to see this many people join us, especially given all that's going on in our lives and politically and with the pandemic and with social justice issues. So very, very cool. And we're just so happy to have you. So without further ado, I guess I'll dig in a little bit more. So I want to introduce myself and the organization that I work for first. My name is Kara Napolitano, and I am the research and training manager for a Denver-based nonprofit called the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking. We've been around since 2005 doing this work, and 2005 is when we wrote our very first human trafficking legislation in Colorado. So really we've been embedded in this movement since the beginning of the movement here in Colorado. I joined the team about 5 years ago. Before that, I was working, a lot of my work before that was overseas. I worked in South America for a while, in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Asia. I was working in mostly post-conflict areas, mostly with internally displaced peoples and sometimes refugees and asylees as well. And we were seeing things like child soldiers and reintegration into families of child soldiers, and people who were selling their children into marriage at very young ages because they couldn't afford to feed them. People who were trading sex to meet their survival needs. These are all forms of trafficking, even though we weren't really calling it anti-trafficking work back then. My work was sort of intersecting with all of these different vulnerabilities and lived experiences. And then came back to the US about six or 7 years ago now, and got involved with LCHT after doing some wage theft work. I suspect, like many of you on this call, I was guilty of thinking that trafficking was this thing that happened in this other place, right? Wherever that is in your mind. I used to think of trafficking as this thing that happens to other people outside of my community or from another country. And when I started to really dig into this work here in Colorado, I realized I was wrong. In fact, a lot of the root causes of trafficking that we see in many of the countries that I was working in really look the same here. Those root causes of vulnerability, right? Poverty, inequality, homelessness, drug use, abuse and neglect. All of these root causes of vulnerabilities, those look the same in Colorado, right? And they're different in each region. They're different lived experiences, but truly it's a similar kind of process of how someone ends up in these exploitative situations. So that's what I really want you to be thinking about today is, what do these vulnerabilities look like where you live? You are all from very different parts of Colorado. I think I saw Baca, Montezuma County, Mesa County, and some counties up in the Northeast as well. So all of the different regions, and of course the greater Denver area is also represented. And so, all of these regions of Colorado have different industries, different vulnerabilities. Perhaps you have a great deal of drug use or gang activity, Perhaps you have jurisdiction questions. And so I want you to be thinking about those vulnerabilities as we're talking through this in a more general way in order to make it more relevant for the work that you do or for the region that you live in. What we hope that you understand by the end of this training are some of the nuances that distinguish trafficking from other crimes. And that's not because we're, sort of rating trafficking as worse than another crime, but we do want you to understand those differences because it's going to matter to the response, what resources are out there to support a survivor, or the lack of resources, what legal avenues a survivor can take, and also, whether or not a survivor self-identifies and kind of understands what's happening to them is in fact trafficking. So we want you to be able to understand those nuances. We hope that you can also identify red flags or behavioral cues. Just kind of recognizing that this is going to intersect with a lot of other experiences. Sometimes people are experiencing both domestic violence and trafficking, or sexual assault and trafficking. Sometimes people are experiencing wage theft, which can sometimes look like trafficking, or they're experiencing both wage theft and labor trafficking. So we want you to be thinking about these high-risk individuals and what those behavioral cues and red flags are going to look like. We will be talking through Colorado specific vulnerabilities. All the ways that we talk about this are Colorado specific. We'll talk through many different scenarios here, and all of them are things that we have seen or we have heard about through the hotline or through our service provider partners. And we will make sure that you know how to get involved at the end. So if you stay with us to the end, we will do sort of an information dump and also have time to answer your questions. So what I'd like to do now is ask you to share with me in the chat, and again, make sure you put in all panelists and attendees, what this phrase means to you. What do you think of when you hear the term human trafficking? Who are we talking about here? What identities, what experiences, who is trafficked or what is trafficking? I mean, I don't need a textbook definition, but just kind of what words and phrases come to mind when you hear this term. And while you're putting those into the chat, I'm going to talk through some of the history of this term. So the term human trafficking was only first starting to be used in the 90s. And then it wasn't until the year 2000 that we defined it into statute. So before the year 2000, of course, there was trafficking, but we were calling it other types of crimes. We were calling it forced migration, forced labor, forced prostitution. We were using terms like child prostitution. We used terms like child soldiers, forced marriages. All of these crimes actually fit under that umbrella of human trafficking, but they didn't officially or legally until the year 2000. So what that means is that we have this very old crime, right? This crime of exploiting other human beings for profit. We've been doing this for, thousands of years as humans, but we didn't define it into statute until only 20 years ago. So we've got this old crime and a very new response, right? 20 years is not a very long time for people to get a better grasp of what trafficking is and what it looks like and how to respond to it. And so what that means is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about this crime. A lot of people are sort of basing their knowledge of the crime on Hollywood movies or TV or social media. And so what we see is a lot of sensationalized imagery and sort of a laser focus on child sex trafficking. And that is a form of trafficking, and it is something that we see, but there's so much more to this. And so I just sort of want to scroll through your responses here because I see them pouring in. So yeah, I see the word slave and slavery. I see profit and currency, absolutely. I saw some people focusing on women. We see sexual exploitation. I keep seeing the word profit, which is great because it's true. I see the word consent, all genders, all nationalities, absolutely. Holding humans hostage sometimes, yeah, through power and control, absolutely. Forced labor through coercion, yeah, it is all of these things, and these are actually super informed responses. So that's really great to see. Yeah, I see someone put in here, immigrant workers. Absolutely. So it's literally all of those things and probably some crimes that you haven't even thought of. And so what we want to do first is make sure that we're all on the same page around the legal definitions that we're using. So when we first defined this crime, we did it at the international level. So at the UN level, we met in Palermo, Italy, actually. And this is how we defined human trafficking: as a severe form of exploitation for labor, which includes sex as a form of labor through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Okay, so in this international definition that was done about 20 years ago, exactly 20 years ago, we included sex as a form of labor. So thinking about like stripping for money. And we also said there has to be an element of force or fraud or coercion for it to be trafficking. If there isn't an element of force, fraud, or coercion, we're likely looking at some other crime. In that same year, in the year 2000, we wrote the TVPA. That's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This is our federal legislation, and it's different. We parsed out our definition into 3 categories. So again, I'm reviewing, this is the UN definition, including sex as a form of labor, and we said there has to be force, fraud, or coercion. In our federal definition, instead of including sex as a form of labor, we actually separated that out. So we said there's sex trafficking and there's labor trafficking. And then we further parsed it out to make that an exception to the force, fraud, or coercion rule. So in that first category, we said that those under the age of 18 involved in any form of commercial sex acts are by definition victims of human trafficking. And that may seem obvious or not controversial, but in fact, it's rather confusing. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking through this one slide because it's really important to better understand some of the complexities around self-identification and disclosure. Okay, so if anyone under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex is by definition a victim of trafficking, regardless of how they self-identify, regardless of whether or not there's force or fraud or coercion, then it's likely that many of us, given the nature of some of your work that I've seen in the chat, that many of us have met someone under the age of 18, let's say 17, who might be trading sex to meet their needs, right? Maybe they're experiencing homelessness and they trade sex for a place to stay. Or they are drug users and they're trading sex for drugs and a place to stay. If they're 17 years old, even if no one is forcing or frauding or coercing them to do so, they are victims of trafficking, right? That's what we said in the writing of this law. Now, it's complicated because if you told that kid, that 17-year-old, that they were victims of trafficking, they might laugh at you. Or they might get offended, right? People don't generally like to be told that they're victims of things when they don't self-identify that way. Nobody's forcing or frauding or coercing them. It's certainly arguable that, you know, society is forcing or frauding or coercing them, right? Circumstance, we call it constrained choice, right? But that's not how our laws are written. So there's no human forcing or frauding or coercing them to do it. So we've got this law that says there can be a victim of something without there being a perpetrator, which makes it very unique, right? So this 17-year-old is willingly trading sex to meet her survival needs. No one's forcing or frauding or coercing her to do so, right? So what that would mean if she was over the age of 18 would be that she was engaging in prostitution. But because we wrote this law, it protects this young person from being arrested or prosecuted for the crime of prostitution by making her a victim of the crime of trafficking. Okay. That commercial component, the word commercial in this context, means trading anything of value. So you already heard me say a place to stay, drugs, a ride, protection, maybe a meal, right? Trading anything of value for any sex act makes it commercial. And it's any sex act. I've used the example of prostitution, but it's any sex act, you know, stripping, pornography, webcamming. Anyone under the age of 18 involved in any form of commercial sex is by definition a victim of trafficking, regardless of how they self-identify. Okay, so now we'll move to the second category, and that's those who are 18 and over. In this category, we said people do have to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order to prove that it is being forced, that it is in fact sex trafficking versus, say, prostitution or legal stripping or something like that, right? So let's make this a little bit more complicated. Let's say that in that first category, that 17-year-old is 17 years, 362 days, and then 5 days later, she's 18, right? So literally nothing in her life has changed. She's still homeless and using drugs and trading sex to meet her survival needs. But now that same person can be arrested for the crime of prostitution if she's selling sex or trading sex, right? Nothing has changed but 5 days, but now she can be arrested. She's not protected by this law, right? Even though her circumstances are sort of forcing her to do it. We call that survival sex, right? Now, I'm not suggesting that nobody willingly sells sex. Of course, there are sex workers who are empowered, who are selling sex. That's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about people who are being forced through force or fraud or coercion. Okay, so let's say, in fact, different situation, an 18-year-old is being forced through force, fraud, or coercion to engage in commercial sex, and they don't want to be, right? They don't want to be doing that. Well, it's usually not as easy to identify as we think, because in fact, most people, the overwhelming majority of people engaged in sex trafficking or in sex trafficking are being forced or frauded or coerced by someone that they know, and usually by someone that they know and love. It is contrary to popular belief. It is contrary to, kind of Google and social media and like the movie Taken. But in fact, all of the data will tell us, and all of the experience that we've had doing this work, that most people are being trafficked by a parent or guardian, an aunt or an uncle, a sibling, someone from up the street that they know, an employer, a teacher. We've had cases of teachers in Colorado, coaches, religious leaders. Overwhelmingly, someone is being trafficked by someone that they know and love. So kind of get that snatched off the street, that Taken movie narrative sort of out of your heads. That is not what we see. Is it possible? Sure, but it is definitely not the common narrative. So let's say this 18-year-old is being forced through force, fraud, or coercion, but she's being forced by her parents. Is she likely to come running up to you and say, "Help me, I'm a victim of human trafficking"? No, right? She loves her parents and she wants to protect them, right? People don't see themselves in that kind of Taken movie narrative and do not self-identify as victims of trafficking. In that case, she likely identifies as not having a great household experience, right? Maybe experiencing some domestic violence, but she doesn't see any other choices. She doesn't want her parents arrested. She doesn't want her boyfriend arrested. Perhaps she's terrified of the consequences of that. And so often people are arrested for crimes that they're forced to commit as a result of their trafficking because they don't disclose. They don't ask for help. They're trying to protect their trafficker. We call it trauma bonding, right? But let's say the person does disclose. Let's say they do want help. Well, then they have to overcome the barrier of being believed, right? Since there's so much misinformation out there, and since so many professions have not yet been trained, so many healthcare providers, child welfare workers, law enforcement officers have still not been trained on this law. And so they're going to have to kind of overcome some of their implicit internal biases to see this person as, in fact, a victim, right? As if their perpetrator isn't, say, standing right next to them. Let's say they are believed, right? Let's say they self-identify, they ask for help, they are believed, and law enforcement has enough evidence to go and arrest the perpetrator. Even in that case, when somebody is arrested for the crime of trafficking, these acts of force or fraud or coercion are often really difficult to prove in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm not suggesting we don't believe survivors, but they're very hard to prove in a court of law. And that's because, think about it, we're talking about coercive tactics here, right? Threats of violence, threats of deportation, right? Threats of hurting a family member. How do you prove that, right? How do you prove they threatened to hurt my sister or they threatened to have my mother deported? It's really hard to prove these things in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt, because often they're not, written down and signed by the trafficker. And so often, even when someone is arrested for the crime of trafficking, they're not actually prosecuted and convicted of that crime. Sometimes they are, but not nearly often enough. And so the rates of convictions, or if you look at like the numbers of convictions that we have in Colorado and in every other state and actually in every other country, those rates are really rather low. And I hope that you can see now why that is, right? People aren't self-identifying, they're not asking for help, they're being missed by the service providers, law enforcement that are here to protect them because we're not trained yet. And even when, you know, all of the things kind of fall into place to allow someone to, you know, actually be arrested for this crime, they're really hard to convict. So the numbers that we do have are simply a drop in the bucket. Often people even don't want to pursue justice through the criminal justice system. They've been through so much, and all they really want to do is go home, right? Or find a safe place to live. Often they choose not to pursue an investigation. So for all of those reasons, our numbers are just a drop in the bucket. The third category here is forced labor. This is the one that simply doesn't get talked about enough. It's the one that, you know, isn't sexy. It doesn't make it into the movies. It doesn't make it into your social media. But in fact, there's significantly more labor trafficking in the world than there is sex trafficking. So I'm gonna throw some numbers at you here. And these are International Labor Organization numbers. The ILO estimates that there are around 25 million people in forced labor in the world today. So 25 million people in forced labor. And remember that international definition includes sex trafficking as a form of labor trafficking, right? So they've lumped sex and labor trafficking together into that 25 million. Now, when we parse that out, it's actually between 5 and 6 million in sex trafficking and between 19 and 20 million in labor trafficking. So significantly more labor trafficking going on. And that's true in the United States as well. So what we see in Colorado is people being trafficked in some of the industries that are less regulated, kind of higher turnover, lower wage, high immigrant population, sort of those hidden professions like domestic servitude, or in restaurants or in hotels. We see it in agriculture and ranching, in the energy sector. We see it in landscaping. As I said, all of these sort of kind of low wage, high turnover, less regulated markets. We also see labor trafficking in illicit markets. So we see people forced to commit crimes against their will through force or fraud or coercion. And that's labor trafficking too. So we see people being forced to mule drugs across the southern border, say from a country in Central America, under threats of extreme violence from gang members. So say some 20-year-old kid gets approached by a gang member who says, I'm gonna kill your sister and mother if you don't do this. Well, so he does it, and he mules drugs across that southern border, and Border Patrol picks him up. Now, is that 20-year-old kid likely to say, help me, officer, I'm a victim of human trafficking? Probably not, right? He doesn't see himself in that narrative. He doesn't think he's a victim of trafficking. And he's terrified, right? He's terrified of the gang back in El Salvador. And so what's a Border Patrol gonna do? He's gonna arrest him and deport him. And I'm not blaming Border Patrol, right? That person didn't ask for help. They appear to be a drug dealer, right? And so Border Patrol is gonna arrest and deport them. So what I'm trying to illustrate with that is that a lot of this is just flying under the radar. We're just not seeing it, even though it's right in front of us. We also see here in Colorado forced drug dealing. Sometimes it's gang related, but sometimes not. Often it's a lot more small scale than we think. A local drug dealer in Grand Junction who fronts an addict, $1,000 worth of drugs, and then says, you owe me $1,000. You got to pay me back, and here's how you're going to do it. And forces that person to commit crimes like breaking and entering or dealing drugs on the street. So panhandling even. And so we see forced labor trafficking with the same sort of more marginalized populations, vulnerable populations here in Colorado. This note at the bottom of this slide that says this isn't limited to those who are foreign-born youth or female females is sort of a shadow of some of these myths and misconceptions, right? We tend to think of this as something that's only happening to folks who are foreign born, to immigrants. It's simply not true. But being foreign born is, of course, a vulnerability, right? In the year 2020, we've seen an uptick of violence against immigrants. We've seen more restrictive immigration policies. We've seen an uptick of nationalism and xenophobia. Immigrants are scared, documented or undocumented. And that makes them less likely to report violence being perpetrated against them. So we're pushing an already marginalized population sort of further underground. But this isn't limited to people who are foreign born. It's about 50-50 in Colorado, 50% immigrants and about 50% domestic. So people from Colorado or surrounding states being exploited here in Colorado. This isn't limited to just youth. Again, sort of contrary to popular social media belief. In fact, according to the ILO, only around 25% of the victims are youth under the age of 18. And we see this again in Colorado as well. About 95% of our calls to the human trafficking hotline are coming from adults or with regard to adults. So the majority of cases that we see are actually adults, but being a youth, of course, is a vulnerability, right? There's an unequal power dynamic between youth and adults. Youth are supposed to do what adults say. Maybe they don't know their rights. Maybe they don't know the minimum wage or that they're supposed to be paid overtime. And additionally, and maybe most importantly, youth's brains aren't fully developed yet until they're 25, 26 years old. And so they are physiologically, there's tons of data to support that people between the ages of 13 and 25 are physiologically more likely to make risky choices. So youth are certainly vulnerable to trafficking, but they're definitely not the majority of trafficking victims. And then females, again, people tend to think of this as a crime that happens to only females and often only female youth. It's simply not true. So again, if I'm kind of harping back to those ILO numbers, the estimate is that only around 75% of sex trafficking victims are female. And that leaves millions of male and transgender individuals who are also being trafficked for sex. And having that transgender identity is yet another layer of vulnerability, right? In labor trafficking, it's around 50-50 male-female. There's some sectors that lend themselves to more victimization of females, like say domestic servitude, and some more to males, like say agriculture. So this is happening to all people, all walks of life, all ages. This next slide here, the action means purpose model is what we're looking at. This is where I'm going to help us to differentiate between other crimes. So in your work or in your everyday lives, when you're kind of sort of trying to question whether or not what you're seeing is trafficking or is it something else, you can use this model, the AMP model, to help you to determine that. So there has to be something from each one of these categories present for it to be trafficking. So first there has to be an action. And by far and away, the most common action is recruitment. So people are identified as having a vulnerability. Remember, I asked you to think about the vulnerabilities in your own community. So someone is identified by a trafficker as having a vulnerability. Perhaps they are experiencing homelessness. Perhaps they are utilizing substances. Perhaps they are a young person who's experiencing abuse or neglect or domestic violence at their home. Maybe they are mentally or physically disabled. Someone is identified as being vulnerable and then recruited by the trafficker when the trafficker offers to meet their needs. Maybe they're desperate for work and they can't find a job. And the trafficker says, I've got a job for you. Or they're desperate for a place to stay because it's cold and it's almost winter. And the trafficker says, I've got a place for you to stay, right? So overwhelmingly someone is recruited. They may be recruited online. And we're seeing an uptick of this alongside the pandemic, where people are just online on their tablets and their computers more often. And it's not only young people that are vulnerable online. Certainly young people are, but so are people who might be mentally disabled or have some cognitive delay, or maybe it's just an adult who has experienced a lot of abuse or neglect and is just looking for love. So there's lots of people who are vulnerable online. We see people recruited in like a peer-to-peer situation. So a trafficker will send in somebody to a homeless shelter, let's say, and the person will befriend other people and kind of offer them an alternative. Come with me, I've got this great place where we can stay. This place sucks, right? Sometimes we see peer-to-peer recruitment in group homes, where a trafficker will send a young person into a group home and say, you know, let's run away. This place is terrible. I've got this person that, you know, takes care of me. Come with me, right? So we see people recruited, let's say, outside of a drug rehabilitation clinic, because people who are using substances are more malleable. I can front you the drug that you like and now you owe me. I can give you the drug that you like and you might do what I say. I can take that drug away and then you'll also do what I say, right? So again, people are recruited likely because they have some vulnerability. Sometimes people are harbored, that's held somewhere against their will, locked up, chained up. Google and the movies would have us believe that everybody is locked up or chained up, but really they aren't. The majority of people are not, in fact, physically locked up, physically being harbored, because they don't need to be. Because the trafficker is using force and coercion and fraud and threats of violence, right? The threats against family members to hold people in those situations, they really don't need bars and locks to hold them in those situations, because they have no other alternatives. Because if they leave this terrible situation, they're headed towards another one, right? So often people don't have to be locked up, but certainly they are sometimes. We've probably all seen kind of horrific videos or pictures of situations where people were locked up, and that is true. Sometimes people are transported. That could be transported across an international border, transported across a state border, transported across town to a motel. But often people are not transported. Sometimes they're being trafficked in their own home in Grand Junction and they never leave Grand Junction, right? Or they're being trafficked by their parents or guardian, right? So people don't have to be transported, but sometimes they are, right? We do see people being moved from place to place so as not to raise suspicion. So maybe they're being trafficked in a restaurant for a month or two, and then they're moved to another location and trafficked in a different restaurant. If it's a sex trafficking situation, maybe they're on their way to Vegas from Minnesota, and they're passing through Colorado on I-70, and they're stopping at various motels to pimp that person out, something like that. So sometimes people are transported. Sometimes people are provided. That's like, I provide access to my kid in order to meet my survival needs. So I provide access to my kid so that we can pay rent, so that we don't become homeless, or so that I can purchase drugs, right? We've seen an uptick of this alongside the opioid crisis, and we fear we may see an uptick of this as the moratorium on evictions is lifted, right? So we see that in mobile home parks and low-income housing areas sometimes. And then there's that obtained piece. That's that, you know, snatched off the street. That's the Taken movie. Certainly that could happen. I've never met a survivor that was their situation. It is definitely not the common narrative. So that snatched off the street, lock up your kids thing, that's not what people are doing. They're specifically targeting vulnerable individuals, and they're doing that for a reason. And the reason is not a nice thing to hear, but it's true that traffickers know that there are people in our society that society values less than other people, right? People who are experiencing homelessness, people who are using drugs, runaway youth, maybe, that are easier to target because they know that nobody's looking for them or will come looking. Now I'm generalizing, right? But those are those marginalized folks. Those are the people that are most vulnerable. The means is through force or fraud or coercion. So the big star there is to remind us that there is an exception to this rule, right? Anyone under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex is by definition a victim of trafficking, regardless of whether or not there's force or fraud or coercion. And the purpose is for commercial sex or labor or services. So at its core, trafficking is about profit, right? Profiting off of someone else's labor or sex work against their will through force or fraud or coercion. And so that's what often differentiates it from other crimes, right? So I'm gonna talk through some of this with a couple of examples, and I just want you to take some deep breaths as I talk through these examples because they're pretty heavy. Okay, so let's say someone is, a young girl is being sexually assaulted by her father. If a young girl under the age of 18 is being sexually assaulted by her father, then she's experiencing child abuse, she's experiencing domestic violence, and she's experiencing sexual assault. But she's not necessarily experiencing trafficking, right? Because there's no commercial component. However, If the father took a video of it and sold it online and made a profit, that would make it trafficking. Or if, say, he invited his friends over and allowed them to pay him for access to his daughter, then she would be experiencing trafficking, right? So there has to be that commercial component. Someone could be experiencing all four of those crimes simultaneously, but it's not trafficking unless there is that commercial component and elements of force, fraud, or coercion if the person is over 18. People often ask what the difference is between wage theft and labor trafficking, because they're both non-payment of wages, right? So I'm going to illustrate that with a scenario as well. So let's say a 22-year-old kid, he's undocumented, and he's looking for work because he lost his job in the pandemic. He was working in a restaurant, lost his job during the pandemic, and he just cannot find work right now. He's pretty desperate. And he meets a local business owner. Let's say he's in Durango. He meets a local restaurant owner who says, I've got a place for you to work. I need a dishwasher. So I'd like you to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. I'm going to pay $12 an hour. And the kid's like, great, perfect, right? So they agree. He's going to get paid every 2 weeks. So in good faith, he shows up at the restaurant every day, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and washes those dishes, works really hard. At the end of 2 weeks, he expects to get paid $12 an hour. And the business owner says, not going to pay you, right? No one's going to believe you, kid. You're a 20-year-old undocumented kid. I'm a respected local business owner. Nobody cares about you. Nobody believes you, right? Get out of here. Now, if that kid can walk out the door and walk down the street and go find a Colorado Legal Services office and sue that business owner for wage theft, well, then that's exactly what he's experienced, is what we would call wage theft. If, however, he can't walk out that door because the door's locked, or because he's being threatened with deportation, because the business owner knows he's undocumented, and if he reports, then he'll have him deported by ICE, or maybe he threatens to deport his family, or maybe he physically harms him, or maybe all four of those things, right? If there are force or fraud or coercion happening and he can't leave, well, then he's being labor trafficked. So that would be the distinction between those two crimes. It's not always quite that cut and dry, I will say, but that's sort of how we can think through that. So again, I want you to be thinking about your own communities. Have you in your community seen people who've experienced abuse or neglect? Probably the answer is yes, because we see that everywhere, right? Are people in your community experiencing homelessness? Is there a shelter to support them? And in that shelter, does that shelter take every identity, or does it just only take females, or does it only take children, right? What if that person has a dog? What if they're an adult? What if they're a family? There's tons of barriers to accessing shelter. What about people in your community? Are people experiencing poverty, or a lack of access to work? Perhaps they're in debt, right? Just about every community has this. The cost of living in Colorado has increased by 77% in the last 10 years. And the median annual income has only increased by 4.5%. So there's lots of people out there living in really precarious situations. And not everybody can find a job. I mean, everything is exacerbated by COVID. But even before that, right? If you have a felony on your record, maybe no one will hire you, or maybe you're too young to work. Maybe you just don't have any skills. We all need income, right? Or are there people in your community who have marginalized identities or are facing discrimination? Probably yes, right? So there's all of these push factors in all of our communities that are sort of pushing folks into precarious situations where they're forced to make decisions to meet their survival needs, literally to survive. And someone is seeing that and exploiting that situation. I know you're experiencing homelessness. I'll give you a place to stay, but it's contingent on you doing X, Y, Z, right? I know that you're lonely, or you're a young person who's experienced abuse or neglect, and I'm gonna reach out and tell you I love you, and I wanna marry you, and I'm gonna take care of you. Come with me. I'll get you out of that abusive household. We'll run away together, right? And then once you get on the road, that situation shifts, and that relationship shifts, and you're asked to do something that you didn't know you were going to be asked to do, right? Not everybody who's working in the informal economy is being trafficked, of course not. But you could see how that need to work in order to, I don't know, buy food for your kids would be an incredibly powerful coercive tactic, right? If you don't keep working, I'm going to report you to ICE, and you're not going to have any food for your kids, and you're going to leave them all alone, right? Or you're not going to have any income whatsoever, or I'm going to kick you out of the place where you're living, right? So there are these push factors in our societies, and then the traffickers pulling people in by offering them their needs, right? Relationship, love, a place to stay, acceptance and opportunity, income, the dignity of work. And so we need to be doing a much better job, like as a society, right? I'm not calling anyone out. We all need to be doing a better job of offering these things on the right side of the screen, because right now the traffickers are doing it better, right? They're winning. They're filling those needs, and that's how people get pulled into these situations. So COVID has had a really incredible impact on human trafficking victims and survivors. There's a heightened risk for those who are already being exploited, right? The pandemic didn't result in people being set free, right? Instead, it was the opposite. Instead, we're going through these incredible economic times. People are suffering, right? People are scared, and people are losing their jobs left and right. And so the traffickers too are going through economic hardship. And so they're likely actually pushing their victims into more exploitative situations, working harder, working more, right? So heightened risk for those who are already being exploited, and then an increased risk of exploitation. We have increased number of people who are vulnerable, right? Millions of people have lost their jobs, or they're in precarious jobs, right? The cost of living is going up. And so people are at risk, and they're desperate, and they're seeking work. And so there's an increased risk of more exploitation. And then there's disrupted response efforts, right? So especially during lockdown, it's lifting a little bit now, but less inspections were happening, right? People weren't going to farms or restaurants and doing those inspections that they would normally do. Not only that, but we just didn't have eyes on people, right? Especially kids. Kids were being kept home. They weren't, so vulnerable kids didn't have their teachers to recognize, potential abuse, or their case managers in a child welfare situation. All of that was being done online. And so we didn't have eyes on kids, right? There was a disrupted effort, or disrupted response efforts. Stay in place orders and economic pressures meant that people were at home with their abusers. So if they were already experiencing abuse, now they're at home with abusers who are also economically stressed, right? So we saw an uptick of child abuse and domestic violence. We had thousands of people in Colorado who were released from detention centers, who were sent home from colleges and universities, and in some cases released directly into homelessness. Again, with limited support. Shelters had to close, right? A lot of victim services had to close for really good reasons, right? But what that meant was there was very little support at a time when we needed even more. People are isolated. People are at home with their abusers without eyes on them. And online education just meant that everyone is online. There's that uptick of people reaching out. And in my conversations with law enforcement, they have confirmed that they have seen an uptick of those cases. Okay, so why Colorado? Why are we having this conversation about trafficking in Colorado? There's lots of reasons, but I'll preface this by saying that all states have trafficking, right? It's not as if trafficking is only happening here, but not in Wyoming or Kansas or Utah or New Mexico, right? All of our surrounding states. Trafficking is happening in all the states. And all the states have their own unique vulnerabilities, industries, and situations that can lead to trafficking. So what we're going to talk about is some factors that lead to trafficking here in Colorado, but I just don't want people to think that, trafficking is greater here than anywhere else. Trafficking is happening everywhere. Small towns, rural communities, big cities, and every country in the world, every town in Colorado, and every state in the US. So I've already talked through some of these first categories here: agriculture, ranching, energy, tourism, construction. I actually live in Summit County, in a place where tourism is our main source of income. Here we have, well, in Summit County in particular, we have about 40% Latino population. Many are undocumented. I don't know what percentage. We've got people living in really precarious situations because the cost of living is so high. And so people are willing to really work for too little money in order to pay those bills. Another thing that we have here is a commercial sex industry. People come here to party. They come here on vacation, and they want to ski and they want to buy sex. What I know is that when we do street outreach in Denver and I'm talking to people who are experiencing homelessness, what I hear is, I was drugged and I was taken to the mountains and I was sold for sex against my will. So the people who we're talking about here are usually young women, but I'm not talking about under 18, mostly in their 20s that I've met, who were already experiencing homelessness, who were already using drugs. Somebody targeted them, plied them with drugs so that they can barely remember what happened, brought them up into the mountains for 2 or 3 weeks, and then basically dumped them out in Denver when they were done. And those people don't seek justice through the criminal justice system because they don't think they're going to be believed. They've already got those identities where people are assuming that they're making bad choices and sort of blaming them. And also they can't even remember, right? They're so traumatized and they've been plied with so many drugs that they don't even remember enough details to report. We've got, trafficking in the construction industry. Think about it. How often do you walk onto a construction site and say, hey, is everyone doing okay? Right? Everyone making the appropriate amount of money? It's just not something that we do. We don't see this happening, even though it's kind of happening right in front of us. We've got transfer points from east to west and north to south. We've got I-70 and I-25, and there is trafficking happening along the highways, but I just don't want us to think that that's the only place that it's happening. People are being moved around, but not necessarily, right? It's happening in small towns too. We've got Denver International Airport. Sometimes people are brought in through the airport specifically to be exploited. I've met people who that's been their situation. They're taken to a construction site, or they're taken to a cleaning agency and forced to work against their will. Denver International Airport's the only international airport within a 500-mile radius. We've talked through the commercial sex industry. We've had 1 million people move to Colorado in the last 10 years, and we've just got a demand. We've got a demand for commercial sex, and we've got a demand for cheap labor and cheap goods. And so when we talk about reducing the demand, we also have to take accountability for the fact that we are contributing through our purchases. When we don't know where our food was picked or where the products came from, then we're not sure whether or not they were made by forced labor. So I know I pick on Google a lot. When we Google trafficking, or when you're shown images of trafficking, this is what it often looks like. Over-sexualized young females being trafficked for sex. And this does happen, right? Young females are trafficked for sex. But this is just one kind of piece of the puzzle. And while we should do everything that we possibly can to stop this, when we're only looking for this is all we can ever find, right? If we're only ever looking for female child sex trafficking, then that's all we'll ever see, and that's all we'll ever prosecute. And it's like a feedback loop, right? That's all we ever see, that's all we're ever looking for, so that's all we ever find. And then that's all we ever call the police on, and that's all they're ever able to prosecute. And so that's what we think exists. Not only that, but if we're missing all of these other identities in our narrative, well, then those people who have those other identities, who have those other lived experiences, are also not seeing themselves in that narrative. They don't know that what's happening to them is trafficking. They don't know that there's help out there, that we have laws in place to protect them as well. And so it's so super important that we adjust our definition of what trafficking is to be more inclusive of all of these different identities and lived experiences. So when we're talking about the issue of human trafficking, we're really asking you to care about individuals who may have made choices that you don't agree with. We're not judging people on their choices. Instead, what we're saying is that we want to live in a society where nobody is exploited. It's never okay. no matter what you do for a living or no matter where you come from, right? Even if you're a sex worker, you're allowed to have human rights, right? Even if you're undocumented, you too have human rights. So I want you to be asking yourselves, like, are you willing to live in a society where someone could be treated as a slave just because they're from another country or because they're experiencing homelessness, right? We have to start caring about those who are often perceived as unworthy and rarely considered victims. Because again, these are the people who are living on the fringes of society, who don't feel like they can come forward and ask for help. And so traffickers are going unpunished, right? Because these situations aren't being reported. And so they just keep operating with impunity, and they think they can get away with it. And so far they can, right? So these are just some, I'm just checking time here, great. So these are just some examples of cases that kind of made it through all of these different barriers, right? People self-identified, they asked for help, they were believed, there was an investigation, and they were able to arrest and convict individuals of trafficking, right? So that's a lot of barriers, but we do have some really great wins. In fact, there was something in the paper today that I didn't get onto the screen today, but there was a sentence today in the 18th Judicial District. If anyone is from the 18th Judicial, like, right on, well done. But there was a conviction, someone received, I think, over 300-year sentence for trafficking in the 18th, which is amazing. So there are wins sometimes. What we're going to see here is, what I'm going to do here is just talk through some of these situations so you can hear about what has happened in Colorado. So I'll start on the left side of the screen here, the Sean Crumpler case. So when Sean Crumpler was first arrested, he was a 50-year-old white male. He was very wealthy, and he had several houses. This is one of his houses that you see here. It's in Aurora. What he would do is he would target vulnerable youth. He would go to places where homeless youth hung out, and he would recruit young boys. He was gay, so he was recruiting young boys to come to his house, basically. He would say, I've got a place for you to stay. We're a family, come live with me. He would offer them drugs and clothes and cell phones, and it was all in exchange for sex with him. This went on for about 8 years. So we don't even know how many boys passed through this house. We do know that some of them grew up and were over 18, and he forced them to go out and recruit more boys. So forced the victims to become victimizers, to become recruiters. He was convicted and is in prison for the rest of his life. The next one I want to talk through is the one at the bottom of the screen. So this was the Brock Franklin case. It was relatively recent, so maybe people heard about it. It says leader of Colorado sex trafficking ring gets 472-year term. Brock Franklin is the guy in the top left of this picture of 6. He was what we would call a guerrilla pimp, so a very violent pimp. And he similarly targeted vulnerable youth, mostly girls. He would look for girls that were experiencing homelessness, that were using substances. He would ply them with drugs. He was very violent, and he was pimping them out all along the Front Range. The reason they were able to get this really high sentence were because some really brave young women were willing to testify against him, and that doesn't always happen. The next one I'll talk about is the one right in the middle. So it says 2018 federal jury awards $330,000 to a family that was trafficked in southeastern Colorado. This one happened in Rocky Ford, so right outside of La Junta. It was a family farm. So the farm owner was a white male, and he married a Filipino woman that was a US citizen. And at some point they decided they wanted to bring her family over from the Philippines. So they hired an immigration attorney, and it took them a little bit of time, but they were successful in bringing over her brother and his wife and their 3 school-aged boys. When they got here, they were on family visas. So they could have just gone on and found jobs and lived their lives. But actually they were lied to by the Sacklers and told that they had to live on the farm and work off their debt. So they were forced to live in really squalid conditions in a house with very little like heat, or there's no refrigerator. It was basically like a shack on the farm. They were forced to work day and night, on the farm, in the farm stand. They were forced to care for his ailing older mother, the parents and the boys too. The boys did go to school, but like not enough. They missed a lot of school. The family was emaciated. They were starving. They were showing up at food banks. They were wearing clothes that were way too big for them. The community started noticing, right? Because it's a small community, only about 3,000 people live in Rocky Ford. And so people started noticing and wanted to help. And what they did is they called Colorado Legal Services and got them in there to do an interview with the family, who realized that they were being trafficked. They didn't think they had enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal court. And so they sued the family in a civil court, and a federal jury agreed with them that they were being trafficked and awarded the family $330,000. So those are some examples. The Fields of Fear, we can go over that one too, but I just want to, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. That one happened up in Hudson, Colorado, and it was one of the first big human trafficking cases in Colorado. You can Google that one. So, okay, so I want to spend the last 15 minutes talking about, like, what are you going to do with all of this? And then we're going to have some time for questions. So I want you to be thinking about those questions. I've seen some things coming in the Q&A. Make sure you are heading into the Q&A feature to enter in those questions. So in order to understand what trafficking is going to look like for service providers or for community members, we first have to understand a little bit about trauma. So people who experience trafficking experience what we call complex trauma, right? It's violent, it happens over time, multiple experiences of trauma. This is complex trauma. And complex trauma affects the brain. So we're talking about psychological trauma that has real physical effects. It actually affects the chemistry of your brain. And so you get stuck in what we would call survival mode. So if you experience complex traumas over time, weeks, months, years of this trauma, basically you're reacting to everything in life as if your life depends on it, because it has for so long. And so you respond to things differently than someone who hasn't experienced trauma. And often it's not what we expect as community members, as service providers. It's just not what we expect someone to say. What we expect is that someone comes running up to us and saying, help me, I'm a victim of trafficking, I need your help, right? And that's just not what happens. So the people have experienced this trauma and they're ashamed, they're embarrassed. They don't want to tell you about all of the horrible things that they've been forced to do, or they blame themselves for bad choices that they think they made, right? There's a lot of victim blaming that happens in this crime. They have a sense of duty or loyalty to their trafficker because their trafficker is their parent, right? Or guardian or husband. The only person that's ever loved them or shown them any love, the only person that got them off the street, the only person that gave them a job, right? Or they're terrified of their trafficker. They're so afraid, they've taken so many beatings, they're not willing to take another one. And all of these things that they've experienced over time has led to a mistrust of institutions and sometimes law enforcement, right? People have missed it. The schools missed it. The counselors missed it, right? The hospital missed it. The child welfare workers missed it because they weren't trained and they didn't see it, and the survivor wasn't asking for help. And maybe they've even been arrested for crimes that they were forced to commit because they missed it. And so they're likely to not trust us, generally speaking, right? Us being service providers or community members, they're really not trusting anyone at this point. And so they may refuse service. They may show no emotional reaction whatsoever. They may be uninterested in cooperating with an investigation because they have no faith in the criminal justice system, or they're irritable or uncooperative, like I would be too if this had happened to me. And so there's so many complexities around identification. Most survivors will not ask for help. This is the first step in making an identification, because we have to understand that people are not going to be trusting us and they're not going to be running up to us and asking us for help. It could be because they don't have the language to put to their experience, or because they don't speak English. It could be because they're unaware of, or they feel like they're unable to access their rights. Maybe they're young and they don't know their rights. Maybe they're an immigrant and they don't know their rights, or they've just been told that they don't have any for so long that they believe it, right? They've experienced physical or social isolation usually intentionally, right? The trafficker has taken them away from their friends and family, or locked them up somewhere, or brought them to a remote location, or they're, you know, working on a farm already in a remote location. They've experienced that stigma, shame, or fear. You know, we've already talked through those. So there's all of these different reasons why people are not asking for help. Now I'm going to talk through some red flags and behavioral cues. Just because of the diversity of everyone that's on this call, it was impossible for me to write, you know, a list of red flags and behavioral cues that are going to be relevant to all of your different work. But what I want you to be thinking about here are these behavioral cues as sort of a constellation, right? There's no 1 + 1 = trafficking. You know, not everybody with an unexplained injury is being trafficked. Of course not. So it's more like when you start to see multiple of these, that's when you should start thinking about taking an action, about your protocol kicking in, or about making a call to a hotline to report. But it's probably going to be multiple physical or behavioral cues that are going to be the real indicator here. So certainly unexplained injuries, but of course that's not a no-brainer. Maybe evidence of prolonged infection or time since injury. So similar to domestic violence, right? People are not being allowed to seek medical care when they need it, if the injury wasn't super severe. So maybe you'll see old bruises or a break that didn't heal properly, right? Something like that. Signs of malnourishment or poor health, right? Traffickers are withholding basic human needs. This is very common. So malnutrition, dehydration, exhaustion. People are kept up for days at a time, right? Because if you're exhausted and hungry and thirsty, you're less likely to run, right? Exposure, frequent STIs, right? A lot of trafficking happens outside, both sex and labor, and people usually don't have the right clothing for the weather. So we see sunburn, frostbite, hypothermia, repeated motion injuries, or injuries from heavy machinery, because people are being told to use machinery that they have no idea how to use, and they don't have the proper safety equipment. I know somebody that was working on a construction site in a trafficking situation, fell off a roof, broke his arm. I mean, he has a 90-degree angle in his forearm. It never healed properly. He never got it set, right? Chronic back pain, right? That's true, but it's not like an easy way to identify trafficking, is it? Tattoos or other types of branding. We see that in sex trafficking sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. Not everybody with a neck tattoo is being trafficked, right? But we do see common tattoos or branding sometimes. I've already talked through substance misuse. People are using substances. So maybe someone is targeted because they're already a substance user. Maybe they're being forced to take drugs so that they're incapacitated, or maybe they're choosing to use drugs in order to numb some of the pain of what they're experiencing. These first 3 bullet points here, these are super, super important. So these are behavioral indicators. Someone who doesn't know where they are, that should be a really big red flag, right? I know we live in a state where people are on vacation, but generally you know what state you're in. And you probably know what town you're in. Someone who claims to be just visiting but doesn't even know what state they're in or where they're staying that night, that should be a big red flag. And people are being moved around purposefully so that they can't build community and have anyone to ask for help. So that's a big red flag. Numerous inconsistencies. That could be for so many reasons, right? Someone might be lying to protect their trafficker because they love their trafficker. It's their parent, right? Or it's their boyfriend. Maybe they're lying to protect their trafficker because the trafficker has threatened them with extreme violence. Or maybe they're lying because they don't trust you. They don't think you're going to help anyway, and they're embarrassed. They don't want to tell you about their horrible things that have happened to them. Or maybe they're lying, or it sounds like lying, because they're traumatized. They cannot remember everything that's happened to them. We see psychosis a lot that's induced by heavy drug use and trauma. So people being fed meth for weeks and weeks at a time, and psychosis is induced, and they actually can't remember what happened over the last few weeks. So how could they tell you their story, right? Or someone who's claiming to speak for or on behalf of someone else. This is so common. I can't tell you how important it is to, whatever your line of work, find a way to get someone separated. We often see like in medical situations, a trafficker will accompany their victim to the hospital and say, hey, I'll do the translating for you. I speak Spanish, right? And the hospital worker's like, great, because we don't have a translator right now. We don't have an interpreter right now. And it would take a while for me to call someone. You do the interpreting. That would be great, right? And then that trafficking victim has no opportunity to ask for help. Their traffickers with them the entire time. And also they probably don't even know what's happening with them physically. So find a way to separate someone in whatever situation. I know that was a medical example, but find a way to separate someone no matter what, so you can have a real conversation with someone. And that doesn't mean that every time you get someone alone, they're going to disclose, right? There's still a lot of trust building that needs to happen. But what you could do is utilize something called universal education, which is when you would just kind of say something kind of general to the person, like, hey, you know, I knew someone that was in a situation similar to yours before. It didn't work out very well for them. I just want you to know there's resources, or I just want you to have this number, or I just want you to know that I care, right? And you look someone in the eye and say, you know, if you're ever ready to leave the situation, or if you ever want my help, I'm here for you, right? Or this number is here for you, you know, depending on what your situation is. But that way you're not like accusing them of being a trafficking victim, because they might not want to tell you. But you could just let them know there are resources, let them know that you see, let them know, treat them like a human, and let them know that you see something's not right, and that there are resources to protect them. Not being in control over their own ID, that's a huge red flag. There's almost no reason why anyone should ever have someone else's ID, almost none. It is not legal for an employer to confiscate their employees' passports in a labor trafficking situation or in a labor situation at all. It is not legal. You could take it and make a copy of it and give it back, but you can't hold on to it. And we see it in sex trafficking situations too, where a pimp will confiscate an ID, just sort of like a power and control move. Like, you can't leave because I got you, I own you, I control you, right? Paranoia, fear, anxiety, submission, someone not making eye contact, someone not being, you know, not wanting your help. These are all signs of trauma. So I know that none of those is particularly easy to identify, but once you start to see multiple, that's when your protocol should kick in, or that's when you might want to call the human trafficking hotline. So what I want you to do now is take out your phones, all 87 of you, take out your phones and put these phone numbers in. We are a 24/7 human trafficking hotline. The Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking has been managing this hotline since 2013. We run it alongside some of our partners, our CONET partners, Colorado Legal Services and Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. This is a tip and referral hotline. So when you call, you could report a tip, or you could ask for advice. You could say, hey, I saw this weird thing and I just want to talk it through with you. The people that answer these calls are human trafficking experts. They go through about 50 hours worth of training and continuing education every year. So you could call and remain anonymous if you want. We'll ask your name, but you don't have to tell us. You can talk through a scenario, you can ask questions, you can request information, you can report something, or maybe you're calling on behalf of a survivor. Maybe the survivor is a friend or a family member. We've got about 350 resources around the state that will support survivors in all of their needs. So the short-term stuff, the crisis stuff, like transportation, short-term housing, long-term housing, clothing, food, you know, case management, mental health resources, physical health resources. You know, we have all of those across the state, but we also have those resources that are more geared towards long-term survivorship, right? Actually, maybe if you were here early, you saw that there are a couple of tattoo artists on this call. Those are some of our tattoo artists who are joining our resource directory that are willing to remove tattoos for survivors of human trafficking. Or we have a partnership with Metropolitan State University in Denver, where we will help mentor survivors through higher education, and 71 survivors have graduated through that program. So we've got the short-term survivor needs and the long-term survivor needs. You can call us, a survivor can call, of course, a community member, law enforcement sometimes calls, because of course not every law enforcement situation results in an arrest. Sometimes you just come across somebody who just needs some help. And you can call our hotline and get those resources in your community. If we do want to report a tip, a couple of things to note here is that we are mandatory reporters of child abuse, which means that we are mandatory reporters of child sex and labor trafficking. So if you are a mandatory reporter of child abuse, then you should know also that you too are a mandatory reporter of child sex and labor trafficking. So when you call, if it's about a youth under the age of 18, we are required to pass that on to our trusted and trained law enforcement officers. However, if the person is an adult, then we allow them the autonomy to make that decision themselves. If they do want to report to law enforcement, or if you do want to report a tip, when we do pass those on to law enforcement, we are passing them on to our trusted and trained law enforcement partners. So we have relationships right now with 46 of the 64 county sheriff's departments. And then we also have really strong working relationships with FBI, CBI, and State Patrol. There are 18 human trafficking task forces around the state. So when we make referrals to law enforcement, we're not kind of randomly calling 911. We're calling somebody who understands these nuances, who's going to treat the victims or survivors with respect that they deserve, and not re-victimize. Okay, so the last couple slides here are a little bit more about how you can get involved in the movement if you're interested. But as an educator, I feel like it's important just to review that we all have these biases, right? It's important that we be aware of our biases and how important it is to use respectful language and try to learn and grow in this process. I mean, this is hard work, right? Caring about human trafficking in general is hard work. We have to be flexible in our expectations. Not everybody is going to want to pursue justice the way that we think they should, right? Not everybody's going to want to leave their trafficker that day when we meet them. We're not saviors, right? And so we have to allow people that autonomy. In fact, that's the only thing that makes us different from a trafficker, is allowing choice, because that person's choice has been taken away from them. So we can let them know that there's resources, we can let them know that we care, but we can't force somebody to report to law enforcement, even though that's really, really super challenging. How can you get more involved in the movement? We hope that you'll volunteer. And Sierra, I hope that you can put some of these resources into the chat for folks. Our hotline is managed by staff, but the lines themselves are answered by volunteer advocates. So if you're interested in becoming a hotline advocate, I hope that you'll follow that link that Sierra is putting into the chat now to learn how to do that. Spread the word in your community. When you see text messages or Facebook posts that you know now, after being here for an hour and a half with me, that are untrue, let people know that those are untrue, right? Don't spread misinformation. Have those uncomfortable conversations at the dinner table. Have a fundraiser to support our efforts, or if you're able, make a donation. Almost all of the people doing this work are working for nonprofits, and we all need donations. Some of the systems folks too. Call or text the hotline. If you see something, say something. Even if it's the smallest amount of information, it may help in an investigation, and we can pass that on to law enforcement. Plug into a local task force. So as I said, there are 18 task forces around the state. A lot of them take community members. They're looking for diversity. Join your local task force, be part of that movement. And if you want to learn more about the task forces in your community, Sierra, if you could put into the chat, you can link up to the Human Trafficking Council. We have a Colorado Human Trafficking Council here, and on their website, they have a list of all of the different task forces and all of their meetings. A lot of them meet monthly or quarterly, and you can find the calendar with all of that information on the council website. And invite us in to train your community or workplace. This was a sort of general 101. I hope it was really useful for you all, but we have specialized trainings that we've developed alongside survivors and professionals from all of these different sectors: healthcare providers, child welfare, CASA advocates, homeless shelter providers, law enforcement, domestic violence and sexual assault service providers. We have a specific curriculum for schools. Invite us into your kids' school. Let us train teachers. And we also have a curriculum especially for youth. So if that is of interest, you can access that on our website, or you can email me directly. I'm the research and training manager. We also provide trainings for the private sector when requested. So that's all I've got. You can feel free to reach out to me anytime. I think you've got my email address in the chat. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. And Sierra, if you wanna come on, I wasn't able, to follow the chat or the questions as they were coming in. Sierra, if you wanna unmute and you can turn on your video too.
I'm not sure if I'm able to start it. Oh, it says I can't.
That's okay. I can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So we have a few questions. First of all, regarding people who say they've had clients who are currently being trafficked, and let's see, yeah, someone who has a client that's being trafficked and who calls them a lot, and they're wondering what to say, and they say that the anti-trafficking task force in the area is aware.
Well, I mean, it's sort of a general question. So, I mean, do you mean to, I don't know if you mean just to support the survivor. I mean, I guess I'll answer this.
Kind of how to support.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. I mean, if a local task force is aware, that means that they're likely receiving the resources that they need. And from like a friendship or sort of a counseling standpoint, you might just want to listen, believe them, because a lot of these stories are really unbelievable and people feel like they won't be believed. So I think start there, practice some active listening, which is a whole lot of not talking, right? Just letting someone listen, letting someone talk, and really actively listening to them. You said that they call, obviously we want eye contact when possible, but that's not, always possible. Just let them tell you what they need. I find that, a lot of people who don't want to report to law enforcement often want to talk to a legal professional, because they are afraid. They're afraid that they might be prosecuted for some crimes that they were forced to commit or something along those lines. Perhaps talking to a legal professional might be helpful. In some cases, they want to talk to other survivors, right? They want to commiserate. They want to talk to others who have been through this and know that it's possible to come out on the other side. In that case, you could call us. There are group conversations that are happening with survivors, depending on what location you're in. Not every rural county or rural community has a group of survivors that get together, but I can try to connect people to survivors so that they can have that mentorship and that companionship. So I'm not sure what else, I'm not sure how else to answer that question, but if there are more specifics, you feel free to reach out to me, whoever asked that question, and we can talk more deeply about it.
Okay, so we also have a couple questions about children who are trafficked, and someone asking, saying that children are protected from participating in commercial sex. Are there similar provisions and protections for adults with developmental disabilities?
Oh, that was a question that I got at the last training as well. And, from a legal perspective, not that I'm aware of. There's different mandatory reporting requirements, right? So that would be at-risk adults in that case. And so if you're a service provider and you're a mandatory reporter, you're likely required to report that. And then law enforcement would get involved. So there are not, there's not an automatic, right, that lack of the need for force, fraud, or coercion. But this is going to go in front of a judge, right, who's going to use their abilities to judge whether or not someone is being coerced. So it's likely that in those cases, even if someone doesn't self-identify, that they are likely being trafficked, and that would be recognized from a legal perspective. Now, if you're talking about trying to get the victim themselves to self-identify, which I understand you probably are, I have a slew of resources that I can share with you. There's the Fund for People with Disabilities that's in Denver. There's the ARC of Aurora, and there's actually ARCs all over, with a lot of resources to kind of help somebody come to that realization, even though they have some mental or physical disability, or mental disability, sorry. There's some videos and some other tools that you can use for that. So I will, I can't remember if I mentioned this, but I will be sending out a follow-up email to all of you, and I will be sure to put those resources in the email. Yeah.
Awesome. And so on the topic of children, what someone asks about child soldiers and whether children who are forced to take up arms in war conflicts are considered, trafficked individuals, and what this falls under.
Yeah, 100%. That is trafficking. That officially became a form of human trafficking in 2008. And so, yes, like forced labor, right? Similar to like forced drug dealing, right? Forced illicit activity, 100% that is a form of trafficking.
Okay, and then in terms of sex trafficking, how many, how many people typically go back to that lifestyle, and what are the biggest reasons for doing so, other than finances and manipulation?
Well, finances and manipulation would be the two big ones. But yes, people do go back. Recidivism is part of the healing process, right? Again, similar to child abuse and domestic violence situations, similar to really any kind of trauma bond. I mean, even similar to any kind of addiction, like, people who've quit cigarettes and gone back. When we're talking about the stages of change, people go back to the life that they knew. They go back because it's the only way they know how to make money. They go back because it's the only place where they were able to find some kind of love, or what they consider to be a version of love. People go back, and it is often because of trauma bonds, which I guess would be a form of manipulation, or for finances. So I can't give you any better reasons, any other reasons. Those are the reasons. They feel like they don't have any other choices, right? They don't have any other skills. This is the only life they've ever known. Think about it from this perspective. Many of you have likely worked in the restaurant industry at some point in your lives. If you lost your job because of the pandemic and you couldn't find any other job in the world outside of the restaurant industry, you'd probably go back to the restaurant industry because that's what you know, and that's how you can do it, and you have experience. It's the same for sex work. People will go back because that's what they have. That's what they know.
And then someone was asking about law enforcement's involvement with sex trafficking, and they mentioned a story where someone they knew went to a police department and then was returned to their pimp, and kind of situations where law enforcement has been involved with sex trafficking. If you could speak about that.
I could a little bit. I don't have any personal experience with this. In other words, I don't know of any law enforcement individuals who've been involved in sex trafficking cases. However, I know that happens. 100% it happens. There's corrupt cops. I mean, there's corrupt everybody's, right? There was a case that I'm aware of recently down in Arizona where there was an investigation of massage parlors, and law enforcement were partaking in sexual services from sex trafficking victims. So that does happen. There's no way for me to tell you how much that happens. What I can say is that's part of the reason why survivors are often afraid to go to law enforcement. But what I will also say is, the law enforcement officers that I know and work with are amazing humans who really care and are doing their best to understand trauma-informed care and support survivors. There's good and bad people everywhere. It's not a great answer, but that's my experience.
And then another person who works for a case management program with formerly homeless individuals asks, they say that many times their clients fall victim to people taking advantage of them in their housing. What are ways I can tell if the activity is crossing the threshold from taking advantage of vulnerable populations to, complete trafficking? What are questions I can ask to parse out the difference?
Well, I do have like lists of questions that you can ask that you could sort of add to your protocol. I'm just going to write that, or Sierra, will you make sure you add that to the list of things that I'll send out in the follow-up email? Off the top of my head, I'm sort of having a hard time with that. I think that I've heard that too. I know that does happen. So I totally validate that question. I think that it's complicated because in those situations, right, people are sort of looking for love, and often it's someone that they love that's taking advantage of that housing situation, and then sometimes pimping them out or pimping out other people from that living situation. I know that that's happening. Um, how can you parse it out? I mean, in the end, the person is going to want it to they're going to have to want it to stop, right? So they're going to have to want to disclose that to you in order for you to help them to make it stop. And that's hard because they probably have a trauma bond with the person. So it's just a matter, I suppose, of really building that trust. I mean, if you already have it, then it's gonna come with time. When that person finally gets to a point where they don't want to take it anymore, you can let them know. You can use that method of universal education to sort of let them know that it's not okay, and that there are resources that you can help if that's happening, kind of thing. Like, don't accuse them of it, but more like let them know that if it might be happening, you could help them. Um, but they're going to likely need to want it to end, and ask for your help in order to make it do so. But I mean, there's actually like hundreds of protocols out there for this. So I'll find the most comprehensive ones and I'll attach those to the email that I send out. I don't know if we have time for one more quick question, Sierra.
Yeah, there's a quick one here, and someone's asking if people are trafficked at the age of 70. This person says that they're a grandma, and asking if people are trafficked at that age, and if so, in what ways.
That I know of, the answer is yes. The oldest person that I know in Colorado that was trafficked was 73, and she was being trafficked in a domestic servitude situation. She'd been kept in the house for, I think, 9 years without being paid and without being allowed to leave. So she was working like as a nanny and a housekeeper, basically, but like locked in and not being paid and not being allowed to leave and being beaten. So yes, that's the case that I know of someone older. I suppose that people could be being trafficked in really any situation, right? If someone's being forced to clean houses or being, I don't know, whatever kind of labor a 70-year-old might be able to still be doing, people are trafficked. I mean, it is really incredible what people will do to each other.
And then one last thing, someone asked when the next public info session will be that their friends are interested.
Yeah, I don't have one scheduled just yet, but we will likely do these quarterly. And I was thinking January, because it's Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So sign up for our newsletter. That's a really good, or not our newsletter, our yeah, I guess it's our newsletter. You can go to the website and it's on every page. You can just sign up to receive email notifications from the organization. So just go to combathumantrafficking.org and sign up for those, and then you'll be notified when that does happen. So that's all we have time for. It's 9 o'clock now. I just, again, want to thank you so much for your time. An hour and a half flies by. If you need more education, that is literally like what I'm here for. So reach out via the website, to my email. I will send out this follow-up email to all of you who registered. So if I have your email address, you will be receiving an email from me. And I so appreciate it. Any questions that I didn't get to, Sierra has taken down and will give to me, and I will be sending out all of the answers to the questions that I wasn't able to answer in this 15 minutes. So thank you. And have a wonderful night. Take care of yourselves tonight. You know, eat some ice cream.